Hey, we have the excitement today to have Ann Bridges with us. She's an author and an editor and a mentor of other authors and a business advisor to independently published authors. And Ann was actually the one that connected me up with Reggie Gibbs, who I've had on a couple times talking about his great Russian novel. So I'm really excited to get to know you a little bit better, Ann. And I was hoping that you could tell us your story, how you got started in life, your childhood, where you're from, how you grew up, what influenced you as a kid and as a teenager, and how did you end up with this diverse number of interests that you have that have brought you into the field of writing and publishing.
Great. Thank you for having me here, actually. It's wonderful to talk to your fans and get a chance to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the more esoteric issues that I deal with on a regular basis. So I basically grew up in the Chicago area, family of five, and I was the fourth of fifth. And for a while, I was the youngest, spoiled baby. And then my parents had an oops child after me. And all of a sudden, I was kind of the abandoned child. So I read constantly. I was fairly precocious. I remember my dad reading comic strips to us on the floor and just teaching us that way, which is a great visual way for kids to learn. But in essence, I was somewhat of a loner. I went to a parochial school, so I didn't know neighborhood kids. I grew up in a fairly religious family, but as I got older, I got a little bit disenchanted by the organization of religion. So I would say I have very high moral standards and really appreciate that background, but haven't continued, I'd say, with the formal religious engagement. Though actually working with Reggie has made me kind of reconsider and reflect a lot on the philosophical issues, right and wrong, good versus evil. I think as we grow up, I think anyone probably reflects on that. Anyway, I ended up coming out to California and Silicon Valley to go to Stanford University and majored in psychology, but recognized that I wanted more of a broad-based education. So played around in a lot of interests of mine, which were English literature, history. I went to England for a year and had a chance to be exposed to different cultures there as well. And then came out and landed looking for a job right at the last recession, depression, the Jimmy Carter era. And unemployment in the Bay Area was huge. So I stumbled along and then ended up being actually in cable television when cable TV was just starting to really take off with the additional channels, technologies, et cetera. And in that case, I was really in the right place at the right time because Silicon Valley was weaning itself from the defense contractors and really getting into the computer industry. And so we had the entertainment industry, the technology industry, and then because I came to it from the communications network industry, I actually understood all three of them. So when the internet came around and the business cases were being discussed and everyone wanted to know who was the company to invest in, I just found myself right there in the middle of all these discussions, worked for a startup IPO, went public, found myself as the only woman in groups of men all the time. And I was generally the youngest one as well. So learned to cope, I guess, more so than the current generation of women who are working in Silicon Valley. You just dealt with issues like all the guys would go to the bathroom at the same time and they keep on talking. And that was just a reality. We didn't ask for, same-sex bathrooms back then. But eventually that became too much for me, working 24/7 basically. And I decided to take some time off, reassess what I wanted to do. And I realized I had some really interesting experiences as a woman and I wanted to write about them. So I decided to write novels and about the Silicon Valley that I saw, really dedicated people, not just VCs, not just, what we see with the Facebook and Google, don't care about anything. Executives that at least get bandied about as being typical. I saw a different kind of typical Silicon Valley. So I wrote a couple novels about that. I did historical with a small independent publisher down in Los Angeles. unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of independent publishers, they went out of business. And so I ended up republishing all of my books and then doing a few more under my own name, and learned kind of the business of the publishing industry. And since I've always loved business, it was a natural fit. And in the course of that, worked with a lot of different authors at different stages of their own writing development. I tend to be self-taught, pretty much everything I've learned. So a jack of all trades, you could argue, not a master of none. But as a result, I was able to help a lot of new authors finish their books, give them input, and it just grew into actually becoming an editor for, I guess, a couple dozen books now that I've done, including helping writers come from their finished manuscript from their point of view all the way to a published book and available for retail, which is a very important process for someone who feels very strongly about their creative message, how to do that, how to make sure it's focused in the best way possible, and then just how to get it out there, what the issues are in dealing with that. So that's kind of my background.
Well, you strike me as a person of high energy, and
Yes.
that because you have that high energy, that you accomplish quite a lot in a given day. Am I right?
Certainly I have, as need be. There are times, there are deadlines. I think that there are, I've been working from home for a number of decades now, so the COVID lockdowns weren't as much of a shock for me, but the workday tends to start at 5 a.m. and wrap up around 8 p.m., but I take breaks in between. So high energy, but it's varied at this point.
So would you say there was anything about your upbringing that instilled that work ethic into you?
Sure. A large family that was not making a lot of money. I started babysitting at age 11, literally. So when people say, what was your first job? That was it. And my parents made me pay for everything that I could, with the exception of like major winter clothes, winter boots. I actually got a first job in retail at age 14. I had to get a special permit to be under 16, worked my way through college, had college debt, had to pay it off. I mean, I just think it was the norm back then. And I've seen studies, in fact, Steve Moore made a comment once that there was a statistical analysis of what people succeed in life. And really, it doesn't matter what kind of job you had when you were a kid. If you had a job, you tended to have a high work ethic and be a much higher achiever than the ones who don't.
And personality wise, would you say that you're more of an extrovert or an introvert?
Oh, very much an extrovert.
And
talk to me. Right?
Jordan Peterson has this big 5 personality scale, and one of the other ones is agreeableness and disagreeableness. Where would you fall on that scale?
Oh, I would probably say agreeable. Well, I don't know, disagreeable. Probably disagreeable if that includes the rebel. There's another scale where I'd say an expressive driver was the old phrase, which is creativity, salespeople, et cetera, and then very goal oriented, as opposed to go along to get along, or someone who spends a lot of time with numbers and analysis. That's not me as much. I can do it, but I very naturally, push for the end and
so you'd be high on openness, but also high on conscientiousness.
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's an ideal mix for somebody who's working in publishing, because you have to have the authorial side and the business side as well. So
yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, and I really hadn't tapped my creative side, I don't think, until I decided to write fiction. I mean, I read it all my life. I always preferred it. But the whole concept
what kind of fiction did you like when you were a kid? You said you loved reading when you were little. What were you reading?
Oh, whatever I could get my hands on. I mean, I started with the Bobbsey twins and the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. I read Gone with the Wind when I was 10.
Oh my gosh.
Homesick. Well, I was homesick.
I didn't read that until I was 30. And
I reread it.
I was also homesick because I had a root canal done, and I was in more pain than I've ever been in my life. So I stayed up all night and read that book.
Well, it's interesting because I didn't really understand the whole concept of the whorehouses, et cetera, or any of the real context of the history. But in some respects, I think it really gave me an interesting perspective when I started learning history in school. And you had the one-sided, the Union was right, the Confederacy was wrong. And I don't think that Gone with the Wind necessarily did anything to promote slavery, but it did say, hey, there were a group of people who were as passionate about their regions and their states, and sacrificed a lot and pulled themselves up again. And Scarlett O'Hara, as a determined young woman, even with the not so great happy ending at the end, it was probably more influential on me than I realized at the time. So that's it. I fell into anything that I could read. Haunted libraries, haunted Brandeis book sales, the used book sales when they came to town. I was just voracious.
I was a voracious reader too, but I did start out with all the Nancy Drew mysteries. In fact, when I was like 8, I think we used to, all the neighborhood kids would gather together and we would do plays based around the Nancy Drew books. And but I loved science fiction. I read every science fiction book I could get my hands on from the time I was probably 10 until, I don't know, whenever life intervened. High school, you get busier with things, but
no, I never got into that. I tried, I read Dune and Stranger in a Strange Land and some Arthur C. Clarke. But the whole fantasy world where you actually had to create for the reader a whole different, sometimes there was language, sometimes just setting, environment, people interactions, creatures, that never resonated with me. I always was very grounded in people interactions and human interactions. That's probably one of the reasons why, when I chose a major in college, I was very comfortable with psychology, and it actually focused on developmental psychology, because I was very fascinated with the human experience, how they grew, how they learned, how they interacted with each other.
Now, have you had any interest at all in Jordan Peterson's work, or?
I think you introduced me to him when we first met. I guess that was a couple of years ago. And I've paid attention as stuff floats across my, Twitter feed, etc. But no, I haven't. I know that there's nothing I've seen of his that I disagree with. Let's put it that way. And he seems to be very grounded in terms of how he communicates these messages. But I haven't followed him. I know that many of your followers do. So if you'd like to talk about it,
just because he's a psychologist, so I just thought there might have been some connection there. But
no.
So it took me a long time to convince you to come on here and talk.
Oh, okay. I guess life intervened in the way.
Yeah. So when we were talking about what we would discuss when we got together, you brought up a few ideas, which I like. And so one of the things that you wanted to talk about was language. And so I'm just going to throw out to you some of the suggestions that you made, and then you can pick it up any place you like.
Okay.
The philosophy of language, the soul deep purpose of writing, the use and misuse of language for communication, and the Chinese mind philosophy via their language structure. So where would you like to start with all that?
Let's start with soulmates, and I'll roll my eyes for all you men out there who've heard the phrase, and it's pop culture, but let's ignore that for a second. There was a great book, and it was actually referred to me by a fellow writer. It's called Soulmates, 2 words, by Thomas More. And there was a section in there where he's talking about how people relate to each other, and specifically via writing. And if you realize that it's been less than 100 years when people used to handwrite, I mean, they literally used inkwells still, and it was a very slow, laborious process to write everything. The concept that he put forward that I thought was very important, and I think we're losing it these days, is that when you write something, you get a lot of time as a writer to not only frame your thoughts to go at the speed that you want to communicate, but you get a chance to review what it is you put down. These days with delete and cut and paste, you can even rearrange it. But at the end of the day, until you're happy with what you're trying to say, you don't share it with the reader. Now, the flip side is the reader can read at his or her own speed as well. And if they don't understand something, they can go back and reread it, savor it, think about it. And unlike other forms of communication, which are real time and somewhat demanding, if you're on the phone with someone, they want to know right away that you're responding, right? If you have dead space on a phone call, that's a bad sign. So I think people have started filling in those gaps of space and time with anything, with lies, with platitudes, with political correct speech. People don't talk at that kind of deep level. And when people used to write letters to each other, and if you've read any of the, people's memoirs that have historical letters written back and forth, John Adams to Abigail Adams, for example, you get a whole different sense of how people developed relationships and how they communicated. They communicated with a very sincere, deep, profound, I'd say important level. You didn't talk about whether or not, it was a sunny day today. You talked about the issues that were affecting you because it was infrequent, but it was paced at the pace you wanted to make it. And that is a very, very different form of communication. And we are losing it, I think, now, where everything is, very little is written as much for that kind of long-term consumption. The number of readers is declining overall. The number of books available is probably increasing, but the number of books read by an average person is decreasing. And I think that's unfortunate, especially when you look at fiction, because that by itself, you do need to create the space and the environment for people to be comfortable to leave behind their own world and get into someone else's world, get into someone else's mind, their perspective, their point of view, and learn from the work that the writer has put into in framing a message, a theme, a lesson to be learned, the moral of the story as it used to be for us.
Well, I certainly see in myself the dangers of the online stuff, because I used to be a voracious reader, and ever since I was never online that much until after 9/11, something happened where I was at home, I was by myself, and my husband had to call me from work and say, you need to turn on the television.
Yeah.
And there was something about that I was out of the loop when this thing happened, right? And so after that, I got into the habit of turning on the news every morning. And before that, I used to have all this peaceful time every day,
Yeah.
And then, of course, when the internet got to be more available, and there are a lot of interesting things there, and I love watching all the YouTube videos and learning things, and I like keeping up with people, and the more and more of that mind share that it takes, and it changes the particularity of your attention in some way. And in the last couple of years, I've gotten really interested in Twitter. I'm very careful about my newsfeed on Twitter. I only have contact with people whose ideas I enjoy. I don't have any political stuff on my Twitter feed, and I try to protect myself as much as possible from just all the random stuff coming through. So I have a wonderful Twitter feed, and I really like the people that I follow. And once in a while, I feel like I want to say something. But I notice that when if you want to say something of any content on Twitter, you have to really think about how you're going to get it down, maybe just to one tweet, or maybe you can think of it in terms of a thread. But even so, you're so highly compressing the ideas, that I know very well that when someone else is reading that, they really don't have any idea what I'm talking about, because they might think, oh yeah, I get that, because I feel that way. A Twitter feed will come across and I'll go, oh yeah, I get that. I get what they're saying. But I'm sure that if I really sat down and explored it with them in a 2-hour conversation, I would find out there's a whole boatload of stuff underneath that, right? Yeah. Because we've compressed down every word so tightly in order to make it fit into that format.
Right. And Twitter actually doubled the length. When I first started using it, it was half that.
I know. And it used to be 144. Now it's 2.
It was crazy. It's a problem. I think someone described Twitter as being like a great big cocktail party, which I think is probably good. You don't ever get into deep discussions. You kind of walk by, make comments, flit around. and occasionally meet someone that's worth offline discussions with.
Mhm.
But I think it's more than that. I think what you're pointing out, the focus and the attention also is that you don't learn as much. They're finding out that kids who are going through the educational process now with all their online books, online reading, they're not retaining as much.
Mhm.
That there is very much a physical manifestation when you are holding a book and you're flipping pages, that when you remember something, you'll remember, oh yeah, that's towards the beginning, it was in the upper page, upper
Mhm.
portion of the page, or it was short, or it was a couple pages long, or it had a graph, or there's something in the page and that just physical reality that helps cement the ideas in your brain more.
Mhm.
So as we've done everything now online, I'm concerned that maybe people are learning it or memorizing it, but they may not be embracing and really internalizing the concepts as well as we did when we were at school.
Mhm. Well, I noticed that my best hours are the first couple of hours of every morning. So on the days when I can discipline myself to stay offline for those 2 hours and just read, that I can really make a lot of progress in thinking deeply about things. But I still find it harder to retain what I'm reading because my mind is it keeps wanting to go, well, there's this idea here, but I could look that up online. Well, no, I'm not going to get online. Oh, this
Right.
word, I wonder what that, wait, I could look that. No, I'm not going to, So
No,
my
you're right.
attention is always being drawn away with the thought that I could get online, but I'm not going to. And so I'm reading, I always try to read very difficult things in the morning, which require me sometimes to read one sentence 2 or 3 times and really try to, download it, so to speak, so that it fits into everything else so I can really explore the concept. But I sure noticed that I'm not anywhere near as effective a reader as I used to be.
Yeah, they also say that men have more visual acuity than women in terms of responsiveness, the concept of hunter versus gatherer, male-female genetics that have developed over millennium. And I wonder sometimes, as all this technology has been developed, and it's mostly developed by and for men initially, video gaming, all this, I don't know if it works as well for women. Let's put it that way. And I think that young girls first are the ones who are saying, I want to put down my phone. I want to curl up, the whole concept of curling up with a book and reading, that coziness. I think that's a very female type of getting away from the world, and maybe boys and men escape more through their eyes, through the video interactive component, but women want to kind of withdraw inside themselves more. I don't know. I just know that it's disconcerting to me, because when you look at the broad publishing industry and the content that's available and being created, it's hard enough, and to have distraction added to the mix where people may not even read an entire chapter at a time. So what do? Write books that are, a half a page. There's no way you can sustain a story, it just doesn't work.
Well, and that makes me think of another thing. I mean, yesterday I was watching a much anticipated video by my little corner of the internet. There was a crossover video with Jordan Peterson, Bishop Barron of the Catholic Church, Jonathan Pajo of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and John Vervaeke, who is a cognitive scientist, agnostic, who's trying to develop a non-church religion. So these 4 guys are talking together. Fascinating conversation. But one of the things that Bishop Barron brought up was the change that took place in the church over about a 50-year period, when they had made an intentional effort at the beginning to change the church to accommodate more to the culture, to the society. And what that ended up doing was completely hollowing out the church. And rather than drawing people in, it actually pushed people away and didn't draw any new people in. And I wonder if the same thing would happen if the publishing industry decided, we want to make reading easier for people. So we're going to make the chapters shorter, and we're going to simplify the language, and we're going to try to capture their attention in a new way. What they'll really do is give up all the people who are actually trying to have a life of the mind, and all the people that they thought they might draw in are going to be still more interested in being online anyway. Why would they go and read a book that's been, I mean, I remember when my daughter was in 7th grade, my older daughter was in 7th grade, and this was back in the 80s. And the schools had gone through this thing where they were using, because the way that they were teaching reading was ineffective. So kids were getting up into junior high school without being able to read very well. So the textbooks had lowered their level of competency. And her science book as a 7th grader was half pictures and half text.
Wow.
And even the text was large text on a page and very simplified. And the funny thing about language is when you simplify it that much, it loses all its meaning. It doesn't convey anything.
Yeah. And I really, in the last few months, have been tearing at that issue from a very interesting point of view. So I write a lot about China. Actually, my Silicon Valley fiction was looking at how China's had reached into Silicon Valley, their reach, the Communist Party, and the investments that they made, and kind of how it had really affected business decisions here. And I realized that very few people have been taught about China. China was locked down basically from 1920 till 1973. So anyone who went through schooling at that time got absolutely no exposure to it, because there was nothing to read, to learn about. It was, old history and then nothingness under Mao. When they finally opened up again, then you had to have a period of time where people could actually write about current China, et cetera. So a lot of people are just ignorant. And that's not pejorative. That is just simply the reality. They're ignorant about what China was and is. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand it from an American's point of view. Fortunately, here in Silicon Valley, we have a lot of Chinese people who've immigrated from various time frames. And so I have some friends who've guided me a lot on my novels and have continued to spend time educating me. But one of them gave me a book called Understanding the Chinese Mind, and understanding the philosophy of China through language. And I had not realized this, but when you look at it, you'll understand when I'm getting to the nitty-gritty. The Western civilization takes their language and they bring it down to the alphabet, right? It's a specific letter at a time. And when you look at how philosophy and science and everything has developed, it's breaking it down. It's understanding it at the tiniest component. And an expert is someone who understands it at that tiny level. The Chinese language, when it was finally developed from a written form, was meant to communicate to the most ignorant peasant, let's put it that way. So Confucius and all the philosophers. And so their language is more pictograph oriented, and it is context. So there's no reason to get down to that specific. What they're trying to do when they communicate is communicate a very broad sense. And some of the conflicts I think we have in communication and in understanding each other's culture comes down to that very basic language issue. In fact, the last chapter of the book said, well, there's not even a word for philosophy in the Chinese language. So when you say, I want to understand Chinese philosophy, you really have to start by saying, well, what do you mean by that? Is it values? Is it structure? What? Religion? And it just kind of was mind-blowing to me that the concept of communication, one is going in one direction to the specificity and the other is going to the broad context. And how in today's world where you're dealing with so many different cultures, and you have Eastern cultures, quote unquote, as large, if not larger than Western cultures, quote unquote, how is this all going to work out? Are we just going to have a clash between two, or are we going to come up with one that incorporates the best of both? I don't know, but all of a sudden I'm thrust into that from a language point of view, because when you're writing for a broad audience, do you write generically and simply, or do you write really high level and hope that people will rise up and use their online thesaurus and dictionary and figure out what it is you're saying?
Well, I think this is where narrative comes in. I'll fill you in a little bit of background on some of the things that we've been talking about here that have to do with language. We've done quite a bit of talk about books by a guy by the name of Owen Barfield, who has this idea about the evolution of consciousness, and that it's way too much to put in a thumbnail. but what happened when I was reading Barfield's books and talking with people about Barfield is that somehow I got off on the path of doing some listening to some old Marshall McLuhan lectures. And one of the things Marshall McLuhan talked about was how just the genesis of written language, when we went to an alphabetic language, I mean, that's going all the way back to Phoenician alphabet, right? That was a kind of a technology that was brought into the society that changed the way people thought. Because prior to that, they had also had a pictographic language. Right. And so it not only, it changes the way you think in many ways. One of the ways is not only the specificity of all the different letters, but each letter itself has no meaning. And obviously it wires your brain in some way when you're writing and you're connecting each letter to the next letter. So it kind of pushes you into a linear way of thinking rather than a global or a circular way of thinking. So there's a lot there. But when I think of what the reason a pictograph is different than this linear alphabetic thing is that, well, let me insert one more thing. I learned Japanese to a fairly sophisticated level when I lived there. And Japanese is neither alphabetic nor pictographic. Well, Japanese have two written languages. One is the Chinese, they've adopted the Chinese characters, but the other is a written language that was developed to actually connect the Chinese characters together, because the Japanese grammar is different. So Japanese grammar requires these extra elements woven in. So they have their own written language for that. That's based on a syllabary. So it's all these syllables. So one of the first things you learn when you learn Japanese is the syllabary, which is a, iu, e, o, kakikukeko, mami, mume, mo, hahihu, heho, raru, ro, ya, you. And so because they're all two-letter syllables, which is another way of thinking. But if we just go back to the pictograph idea, the thing about a pictograph is it leaves spaces for other thinking. So let me give you an example. One of the ones I really like, I learned about when I was a missionary in Japan. There's a Chinese character for the word righteousness. But the Chinese character is made up of two parts. You know, some of them have four parts, and some of them have a long side and two small. But this one was made up of a top and a bottom. And the top is the Chinese character for lamb. And the bottom one is the Chinese character for me. So righteousness is the lamb above me, or the lamb over me. That's very mysterious, because this was way pre-Christian that pictograph was developed. And but what happens is, so a Chinese person is looking at that, they may have memorized that has a certain meaning, but doesn't that leave a lot of space for thought? I mean, there's so many ways that you could think about that picture. That's not, you know, we might just say, oh, righteousness is living the right way or being morally good or something. We can find a very hard and fast little crystalline definition for that. But that pictograph leaves this broad range of things. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about here is that true meaning can only come in narrative. You have to have the narrative to convey the depth of what the meaning actually is. You can't get the meaning out of a word. very often you can't even get the meaning out of a sentence or a paragraph. But if you have a narrative, you not only have a meaning, but you also have a meaning that you can plug yourself into someplace. You can identify with one or all of the characters at any given point, and you can think your way through all the aspects of meaning that might be involved there.
Yeah, I agree. The concept of context, the concept of the open-endedness, I think it frustrates a lot of Westerners dealing with China and Chinese business people or whatever, because they go, well, they're not really answering the question, or it's vague, or it seems like they're contradicting themselves. And when you talk to them, they're going, oh no, I meant that. I wanted you to interpret, or I don't want to be specific, because there are many possibilities. And, you know, my driver personality says, no, you gotta identify, we're gonna sign a contract. No. So it's just a whole different way of looking at life. And it gives you a lot of freedom. I've had some discussions with which is freer, a society that tells you can't criticize the government, but you can criticize everyone else, versus America, for example, where freedom of speech maybe is put in the Constitution, but we have this concept of political correctness, or we have different media outlets, for example, painting a narrative a different way. And so that is just equally confusing to them. And if I were a young person growing up today trying to figure out language and what is right or wrong, what is truth or not, I think it's mind-boggling. And the best we can do, I think, is to teach them critical thinking and teach them how the media world works, how the narratives work, how they can have their minds shaped in a direction possibly that they aren't aware of. And so basically heightened consciousness becomes one of the most important elements, I think, to teach at an early age.
Well, one of the guys I like to listen to, and I don't know if this would be on your Salience landscape or not, but his name is Jonathan Pajo. And he is trying to teach people what he calls symbolic thinking. And he takes like movies and takes them apart and shows you what the narrative structure is of the movie. And all the great stories of all time, and Jordan Peterson does this too, all the great stories of all time have basically the same narrative structure, right? But what's happening, and so it's very good for people to know that, because then when you see a narrative structure that's strictly propagandistic, which is what's happening nowadays, all the movies are strictly propagandistic. You can see right away, they have diverted from the great narrative structure of all other great literature, and they've changed the narrative structure in some way. They've turned it upside down, or they've inserted a propagandistic element. And a part of critical thinking is really to be able to see, oh, that's the place that they did it. So then you can see what their purpose is, what their intention is, what they're trying to convince you of. Because if you don't have that and you go into movies and you just let that stuff wash over you and you think that's the way the world is, you're getting a really strange picture of the world. We went to a movie a few weeks ago because we thought it was a different movie. And after I got halfway through the movie, I thought, what are we even doing here? It's called The Eternals.
Okay.
And it's one of these, it's kind of a fantasy, lots of different heroes all in one movie. But they altered the great narrative structure in every possible way until it's such a confused jumble of garbage and all completely political. And you're just there to have a good time. These people are trying to do this mind-bending thing with you, you know. All the heroes now have to be women, and not feminine women. They have to be butt-kicking women, you know, who are massively strong and taking the place of the men. And I don't know.
Yeah, that's a real sad portion of what's happened, I think, to the mass media. But now you go into what can individual artists do, and I do the broad artist, because I think you're a painter. Photography has been hugely impacted by the digitalization, music clearly, and books. And one of the things that I try to work with authors about is, what is your purpose, right? If you've just spent the time, because by the time someone's coming to me, they've usually spent a year, maybe more, working on one specific novel generally, though I do work with nonfiction as well, but they have a reason they put this effort in. And one of the things that I think I bring to the table is being able to say, once I read through it, did you accomplish your purpose? Or what is the audience, right? So they may have a purpose to reach, like Reggie's book was to reach a faith-based group of people, but very intelligent, because his book is like dealing with Russian philosophers and, good and evil. I mean, I ramped up my self-education like 3 notches with him. I reread Brothers Karamazov. I read Life and Fate. Yeah, I mean, he just made me read all sorts of things, but it was good. It was healthy. But at the end of the day, was he accomplishing what he wanted to accomplish? And was he the authentic voice to be able to do that? And so you have to work through that. I don't know in the movies whether they're doing that as much as they're saying, well, we know this sells, or we know we can distribute this to certain markets, and we don't care as long as we can sell the tickets. Mm-hmm. And so you have the publishing industry is similar. We know what will sell. So you have the commercial writers, but that's not necessarily very, very fulfilling for a lot of people who have a different purpose or aren't necessarily motivated to have this as a writing career, but they definitely do want to write a story, have a narrative story that will be used for a specific purpose. There's a local lawyer I worked with here who specialized in domestic abuse, and he wrote a fictional account. It was kind of a compilation of all of his cases about a young girl whose spine was broken by her husband during rough sex. And he said, I wrote this because I wanted a book like this when I was a lawyer, to be able to hand it to my clients and say, this is how the legal system works, at least in Santa Clara County. It's not like Law and Order on TV where everything was resolved in 60 minutes. This is going to take years, and you have setbacks, and you're going to have to be, your life is going to be put in public view, and you have corruption, and it's just like all these things. But his purpose is very much the other lawyers to give these to clients and to give them to domestic shelters. Well, who cares whether Barnes and Noble carries it, right? Or whether Amazon carries it? He has a whole very, very specific niche market. And so understanding that, then you write the story for that purpose, and you have to edit it for that purpose. Mm-hmm. Whether you have clean language or not, is it appropriate? Is it considered offensive? That's a whole different level today. Sex, mm-hmm. The R-rated stuff. So commercialization versus art has probably always been out there as a break between the two, but probably more so even now, because the opportunities to do something individually are huge, all this enabling technology, but you're also being compared to these massive big budget books, movies, music, art, and it's discouraging for a lot of individual artists, I think.
What would you say is the percentage of books that are being self-published now?
Oh, it's growing. In terms of titles, I would say it's probably more than half, maybe 80%. Wow. Yeah, because the publishing
mostly happening through Amazon or through individual imprints, or?
Well, when all is said and done, there are only a few printers. And only a few printers and only a few distribution channels. Okay, so it's kind of aggregated. And the big publishing houses have really stripped down to very tiny staffs. So what they bring to the table to an author is, if you're basically in your mid-30s and you want to have a writing career for the next 20 to 30 years, and you're willing to pump out what sells on a regular basis, like one book a year at least, then they want to work with you because you are going to be developing a brand. If you're older than that, if you only have 1 or 2 books in you, you're just not attractive enough to them. Most of it is nonfiction. In fact, if you look at all the memoirs and all the political books, the fiction is dying for adults. For kids, it's still exploding. I think there's some young adult, new adult. Romance is always a huge one, but on those, you're actually churning out literally a book, I've heard, as fast as every 2 weeks. Because the people who read them want to read them. Oh, they finish a book in an hour and they want the next one. So it's a crazy demand on an author. Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So there's a balance point, and that it becomes very personalized. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? How much time do you have? What are your goals? And some people's goals literally are to be published through a major publishing house, but I can help them and I can advise them on what the realities are. A lot of them don't want to face those realities. It's a very different world. It's not like it used to be in terms of really getting the accolades. You get a PR, if you go through a major firm, you get a lot of PR support, but they take a lot of money for that. So you don't make much per book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, most people don't get rich writing books anyway, do they?
No, very much. No, but some do, right? And they hear about it. Oh, I want to be the James Patterson. I want to be the J.K. Rowling. But if you can name them, it's few. It's the average book, sells 200 titles, say 200 copies. Okay. That means half of them sell fewer than that. So if you look at a bell curve, it's just this really long tail. There are a few titles, a few authors who sell millions and do very well. Most of the people don't. They're doing it for a different purpose, or they just don't work.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Not to be discouraging, but I think that so let's go back to Reggie a second, because he was interesting to work with. He's for those of you who didn't get a chance to see that, he's a ex-Marine, and he had some really horrific experiences in Iraq, and he wanted to write about what he went through as a soldier, but he said it in Stalingrad in 1944. And so the first draft was distant, I'll say, and a little chaotic. And so I understood immediately that the power of his words, he's a great writer, but the power of his words was to get him to open up emotionally. And so we go back to the soulmates issue, to get him to understand that taking the time to really tap into those inner emotions is what would draw the reader in as well. The shock value of some of the scenes, the little details, like he described how for a soldier, snow catches on your collar and then it melts, and then you have ice water dripping down your back. To me, I'm like a real cold, sensitive person. That was so vivid, and I never would have thought of that. You think, oh, you've got uniforms. He goes, no, that happened all the time. And he had another scene where he stumbled across a person dying, and I told him that I thought that was one of the most poignant ones, and he said, yeah, well, that was based on a reality, except it was a 4-year-old Iraqi girl that he ran across like that. And that to me was even more powerful, the reality. But I just basically kept on saying, come on, you can do more, be more vivid, be more emotional. And it tapped into a whole spirituality over the last couple of years, that he's realized what he learned from being a soldier was really facing evil, and how his faith supported that. So that was a direction, I think, that if he had pre-sold that book to a publishing house who just wanted to do military history, they wouldn't have let him go in that direction. And in fact, when he went to a publisher, they said, you have to get rid of all profanity, which for a soldier is kind of part and parcel even back then. And they even told him he couldn't use a footnoted reference to The Idiot by Dostoevsky, because it had the word idiot in it. Zero tolerance policy. So isn't that amazing? So he went and found a different publisher. But
and that sounds like an internet meme. That doesn't sound like it could possibly be real.
No, it was a Christian publisher, very well respected, and they said, we do not let any words in. So to me, I just
if he had gone to a secular publisher, they would have said, you can't have that scene in there that's inside the Eastern Orthodox Church with all the beautiful art.
Yep. Or you can't
Right.
have Satan here, or you can't, it was so if you're really reflecting your life as a person, which is broad and may have all sorts of different influences.
Mhm.
Publishing industry is very strict in terms of genres because they know what sells. And readers, by and large, are comfortable choosing those genres. But I think the word of mouth and the things you do, for example, Karen, in terms of exposing people to maybe the lesser known writers, but who have a wonderful story to tell, is a very important portion of the whole media landscape, because how else do you find out about them? There aren't newspapers that do book reviews anymore. It has to be word of mouth or social media, I guess.
Yeah, well, I wish I could have given him more exposure. This is a very small channel, so we just don't have that many people.
Well,
There are so many options on the internet that people have a million choices of what to watch, and
yeah, the reality of the authorship too is that you end up having to market yourself. And that's true whether you go with a big publisher, if you're fortunate enough to land that way. They expect you as writer to know exactly who you're trying to talk to. You're going to go out, you're going to do speaking engagements, you're going to get book reviews yourself, you're going to, just the whole marketing and PR falls into your lap. Or you pay for them to do it, but they don't often know your book very well. So it's kind of a crazy environment right now.
well, a few years ago, I got very interested in this woman neuroscientist who did some work around the neuroscience of eating, kind of helping people with addictions and so forth. And after I'd gotten interested in watching some of her stuff, she decided to write a book because her tribe was growing. And then she explained that she had seen this thing online, one of these little training things that come online that said, we'll help you become a New York Times bestseller. So she decided she was going to do that. So while she's writing the book, she's following all the steps that you have to take to be a New York Times bestseller. I don't remember what they all were, but I remember one of them was get a mailing list of all the people that are interested in you, and then try to keep expanding your mailing list. And then you have certain free content you give to the people on your mailing list that they can share with others, so you can expand your mailing list. So when it comes time to publish, you can blast out to all these people pre-publication and get them to buy your book pre-publication, because that will boost you up on the charts before it becomes public. And she did all those things. She is a nobody from nowhere, but she did all those things. And on the first day that her book published, she was first place on the New York Times publishing list.
Good. It doesn't take that many copies. I think it's I'm gonna say it's like 2,000 or something in the first day or week to get that. A lot of people game the system. I've heard Kindle or Amazon used to do that, where you were number one in your category if there are X number of sales in a 15-minute period. So people would have all their friends order at midnight, on the first day, and then it would show up as a number one.
They also just make more and more and more and more and more and more categories.
Right.
So within the business category, there might be 150 different kinds of business books in that category.
Exactly. And then the question is, so you want to be a New York Times bestseller, what are you going to do with that? I mean, a lot of people build their career. I had co-authored a book with a very well-respected geologist who was told flat out, if he wanted to get kind of the next step of respect for his learning, he needed to be published. And he said, well, screw it. So he approached me and said, would you, work with me on this book? Well, I want to make it an easy to read book on geology. Okay, fine. Again, my master, jack of all trades, master of none, never took a geology class in my life, but okay, we'll figure this out. And it worked. He got the credentials to having been a published author, and he didn't really care. He doesn't care that people buy it as much. He cares that people read it, and he wants people to use it as a resource. He sees the value to it. But beyond that, it really did help him in his career path. So you just kind of have to know yourself and know what you're spending your time on. I do want to bring up something real quick. You had an interview a couple weeks ago with someone who was doing artificial intelligence and language, I think, right?
Paula Boddington.
Programming language. And one of the things that struck me was he said that it was hard to have the computer understand what life is outside the boundary, right? There's inside the boundary and then there's outside the boundary. And I thought that was a fascinating reflection on what I run across with people all the time in writing, which is the point of view, the perspective, that when you're in a character's head, you have to be very consistent in what that person can see. For example, if I say, oh, she walked through the building without noticing XYZ. Well, if she didn't notice it, how can you be writing it, right? Yeah. That didn't happen. Very subtle cues in terms of language, even like if you say, I turned a corner and saw a car versus I turned a corner and saw the car versus I turned a corner and saw my car, that those articles have a very different sense to the reader. And while you as a reader may not understand or pick up the very specific words, you have a sense when it doesn't work. You kind of reject it. And that concept of perspective, that concept of there's a world outside of me versus a world that I'm dealing with, I think is very important when you get into AI. It reminds me more, to bring back to the whole Chinese language thing, it reminds me more of the Chinese language and the Chinese philosophy, where it's open and contextual, except I think yin yang, the yin and the yang flew back and forth, but it's still contained in a circle. And it seems to me a lot of the AI work that's happening these days is driven a lot from China. And I wonder sometimes if they're going to run into a problem, a technological problem, because they may not conceive of it the same way, that you have to write something that's outside of the experience because that's how humans act versus what the computer is going to do. It's my theory.
Yeah, well, and so Jordan Peterson has talked about this before too, about the problem of when they first started doing AI, they didn't realize that perception is so embodied. They thought that perception was more like a camera that could just focus on things and you could define the boundary and figure out what it is that you're looking at with AI. But they found out that AI actually needs to have some sort of body in order to even perceive what it's seeing out there, because, and of course, AI isn't sentient yet, but there needs to be some sense of what, like if you're looking at a 2D photograph, if you didn't have already all the experience to differentiate, oh, that's a form, that's a cylinder, oh, that must be somebody's leg, right? We have all this experience that we've had in the past of what that shape is, and we can differentiate it off of that 2D screen amongst all those pixels. But for a computer, it's just looking at pixels.
Right.
Some of them are light, some of them are dark, some of them are this color, some are that color. But that's all it is pixels. And so the only way they can differentiate is if you are already embedded all of this background experience and information inside the AI so that it has some way to make those connections with what it's looking at.
Yeah, and I think you also, the computer industry and the technology has been so focused on quantity that they're able to do so much more in terms of quantity, that they've lost the concept of quality, which is what you're kind of describing. And when you get into ethics and you get into values, which is really part of the human experience, and you're expecting that AI is going to simply replace humans, it doesn't work, because which value are you going to put in there? The God and the machine, who's going to be making those judgments? I worked with a Google engineer who's working on the self-driving car, and he said the problem they had is if you have 4 cars arrive at the 4-way stop simultaneously, they will sit there because the rule is the one that gets there first goes, and they don't have a sense of fairness or humility that says, no, you go first. They didn't know how to deal with that. And those are tiny little value judgments. What do you do with the big ones of do you mow over the little child or the grandma if the car is losing control? If you know, do you kill the driver or the passenger if the car is losing control? How do you deal with these things? And I think that is the concept of embodiment and the concept of quality of life. And I don't know whether or not the computer language has a nuance yet to be able to do that. They can wow us with what they can do mechanically and in speed, but I have yet to be wowed on the ethics.
Well, I mean, that's probably why Elon Musk says that it's AI is the existential risk of the future completely. I mean,
Yeah.
because I don't know how do you find answers for that, especially in a time when we're so politically divided and the political divide is so extreme. And if we flip back and forth from one party to the next every 4 years, which is perfectly possible because it's pretty much 50-50, it's just going to fall on either side of the line all the time. And if we continue moving in the direction where people are demanding more and more authoritarian control for their self-protection, then we're giving more and more power to the government and to these large quasi-governmental agencies called Google, Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, then whoever controls the political environment at that time is going to control all the ethical decisions made by the AI. And hopefully we would still keep going back and forth every 4 years, party to party, but once one party gets hold of the ethical decisions of the AI, how do we know we'll ever get back to the other side again? I mean, those are the kinds of calculus that I think Elon Musk is looking at,
Yeah, and it's more than just calculus even. I think it's more than just political parties. I think when you're dealing with China, as an example, they're not the only ones, but they are clearly ahead and making this a big deal. If their value system is very, very different than ours in terms of authoritarian, and you get back to the philosophical basis that in China, tranquility and conformity is more important than independence and individualism and happiness. And so they don't understand why you wouldn't just be happy. If you're just like everyone else, what's wrong with that? And Americans go, oh, no, can't have that. So I think the answer is probably not to have one answer. The answer is to have many choices, whether it's marketplace or freedom of religion, however you want to frame it. This one size fits all X, whether it's software or medicine or politics, just does not work. Humans are way too complex right now. And I think that the computer industry needs to break away from the concept that has worked so well for the last couple of years of the benefits of compatibility and network interconnectivity, and instead let the people come away from a network, have multiple networks, have multiple ways of accomplishing the same thing in a human-based society.
Well, I, for one, am super glad that there's people like you thinking about these things and that you're there to help authors to really explore their intent and their ability to execute on that intent so that we can have this diversity of thought out there in the world. And I've really enjoyed talking to you, Anne, and I think we probably have a half a dozen topics that we haven't touched on yet. We could do this again sometime.
Probably not. I'm happy to do so. Critical thinking is probably a biggie, but as time goes on, there probably.
So I know you mentioned critical thinking, but isn't that one of those things that it all depends on what you mean by critical thinking when you say you're going to teach critical thinking?
Yes, there's probably a bias.
I've seen critical thinking taught in ways that were very counterproductive.
I got really scared when I saw media literacy. There's like a National Association of Media Literacy Education. It happens every week. And it basically is totally biased towards traditional media, which means it's more liberal. And it was basically saying, see, if this is something being put forward by Fox News, you can assume it's wrong. I mean, this is what they're teaching kids. And if it's put forward by PBS, it's right because there are experts there. And I just went, well, this is not critical thinking. This is continuing a propaganda. So I think critical thinking is teaching kids how, kind of what you described, how to recognize that there's a narrative that's being told and look at what's being omitted. I think editorial, people have forgotten that much of editorial is shaped by not just what is included, but what is not being included, what is not being emphasized. And kids need to learn that. Adults need to learn that too.
Yep. Well, I'm glad you're out there fighting the good fight.
Ditto.
It's been a delight talking with you. I hope we get to do it again soon. Thank you, Ann.
Be happy to do it. Be happy to do it. And good luck. And let me know when, if there's anyone out there who just wants to chat about writing or anything like that, I'm happy to talk. I'm sure you're going to have contact information on your webpage, right?
Right. I'll put everything down there with all your contacts and your website and your background, and super
Great.
cool. Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks, Karen.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.